There is a moment in Kirk Douglas's life that almost nobody talks about, because it doesn't fit the image of the man who played gladiators and cowboys and never once looked afraid on screen. In 1996, after a stroke left him barely able to speak, the legendary actor sat alone with a gun in his hand and put it in his mouth. And then, by his own account, years later, something almost absurd happened. The gun caught on a tooth. It hurt. And that small, stupid physical pain, a toothache of all things, made him stop. He would later say, with the same dark humor that carried him through 80 years in Hollywood, that a toothache was the thing that stopped him from committing suicide. It's the kind of detail you don't put in a movie poster. It's real and human and almost unbearably honest. And it's only the beginning of what this family actually went through, 3 generations deep, behind one of the most famous last names in the history of American film. Because Kirk Douglas didn't just survive that moment. He went on to live to 103 years old. His son, Michael Douglas, would one day face his own death sentence, a stage 4 cancer diagnosis that started as a lie he told the press. And Michael's own son, Cameron, would spend years lost in an addiction so severe it eventually put him in a prison cell, in solitary confinement, while his father quietly wondered if he'd ever see him alive again. 3 generations, 1 family, and a story about survival that has almost nothing to do with the movies any of them are actually famous for. Stay with this one, because what's coming isn't the story you think you already know about a famous Hollywood family. It's a story about a grandfather who nearly ended his own life and instead lived to be older than almost anyone in his profession ever has. A father who lied to the entire world about what kind of cancer he had because he was too afraid to cancel a movie tour. And a son who spent years injecting drugs directly into his own veins while sitting on more privilege than most people could imagine in 10 lifetimes. 3 men. 3 separate brushes with death, and a family that somehow, against every reasonable expectation, is still standing. This story matters because we tend to look at families like the Douglases and see only the surface, the Oscars, the premieres, the string of hit films spanning 80 years. What we don't see is what it actually costs a family to carry that kind of legacy, generation after generation, and what it takes to keep loving each other through addiction, cancer, near death, and decades of very public, very human failure. To understand how all 3 of these men ended up fighting for their lives, each in his own way, you have to start where the story starts. With a poor kid from Amsterdam, New York, born under a name almost nobody remembers today. Kirk Douglas was born Isur Danielovich, the son of Russian Jewish immigrants, and he grew up genuinely poor, working odd jobs just to pay his way through college before eventually training as an actor in New York. There was nothing handed to him. No famous last name to open doors, no fortune waiting in the background. He built every ounce of what came next with nothing but talent and an almost frightening determination. The same determination, it turns out, that would carry him through decades of the industry's biggest highs and, eventually, some of the darkest moments of his life. By the 1950s and 60s, he had become one of the biggest movie stars on the planet, the cleft-chinned leading man behind films like Spartacus and Lust for Life, a 3-time Oscar nominee who would eventually receive an honorary Academy Award for his lifetime of work. He married twice, first to actress Diana Dill, with whom he had 2 sons, Michael and Joel, and later to Ann Bidens, with whom he had 2 more sons, Peter and Eric. Here's the detail almost nobody remembers when they think about the golden age glamour of the Douglas name. Of those 4 sons, one of them, Eric, would eventually die of a drug overdose in 2004, at just 46 years old. It's a quiet, devastating fact that tends to get lost underneath everything else this family is known for. And it's the first sign of a pattern that would return, decades later, to threaten another generation of this same family. But before any of that, there was Michael, Kirk's eldest son, the boy who grew up watching his father become one of the most famous men in the world, and who would spend years of his own life trying to build something separate from that shadow, before eventually becoming just as famous in his own right. Michael Douglas built his own extraordinary career. Wall Street, Fatal Attraction, Basic Instinct. A Best Actor Oscar of his own. It wasn't handed to him either, at least not entirely. Growing up as Kirk Douglas's son meant every early success came with a whisper attached, the assumption that the name alone had opened the door. Michael spent years proving otherwise, eventually building a career distinct enough from his father's that the two of them could stand as equals rather than as legend and shadow. In 1977, he married Deandra Luker, and the following year they had a son. They named him Cameron. The marriage would eventually end in 1995, after nearly 2 decades together. But the son they raised together would remain, for both of them, the center of a story neither could have predicted. If you're picturing a golden childhood, the grandson of one legend, the son of another, born into wealth and privilege most people can't imagine, you'd be right. And that's exactly the problem. Cameron Douglas would later write in his own words, a sentence that captures the entire weight of what it meant to grow up inside this family. Every son admires his father, he said, but everyone in the world admired his. Try to sit with that for a second. Most kids' fathers are simply their fathers, flawed, ordinary, private. Cameron's father was a global movie star, and his grandfather was a legend on top of that. There was nowhere to hide, no ordinary version of his own life to grow into. And somewhere inside that impossible pressure, at just 13 years old, Cameron started smoking marijuana. By 15, cocaine. By 17, crystal meth. It got so much worse from there that it's genuinely difficult to describe without pausing. Cameron eventually became addicted to injecting liquid cocaine directly into his veins, something users call a bell ringer, because of the ringing sound it creates in your head. He has said he used it up to 3 times an hour. The needles scarred his veins so badly they began to collapse. So he started injecting into his ribs, into his neck, anywhere he could still find a vein that worked. This was happening to the grandson of Kirk Douglas, the son of Michael Douglas. A young man with every possible advantage the world could offer, disappearing in real time into one of the most severe addictions imaginable, largely out of public view, while his family's name kept appearing on movie posters and magazine covers. In 2009, it finally caught up with him. Cameron was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for conspiracy to distribute methamphetamine and cocaine. And then, while he was already behind bars, authorities caught him smuggling more drugs into the prison itself, which added years more to his sentence. In total, Cameron would spend 7 years in federal custody, including nearly a year in solitary confinement, locked in a small cell, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. For something as small as failing a single drug test, Michael Douglas, meanwhile, was living through what might be the most quietly devastating question a parent can be asked. For years, he watched his son cycle through arrests and relapses from a distance he later admitted he had to force himself to maintain, simply to survive it emotionally himself. At the height of Cameron's addiction, Michael has said, he had to detach, not because he stopped loving his son, but because loving him with his whole heart, every single day, watching him destroy himself, would have destroyed Michael too. It's an uncomfortable thing for a father to admit publicly, and yet he did, years later, in a joint interview with his son that neither of them shied away from. In that same interview, Cameron finally asked his father directly, "Was there ever a point where you truly gave up on me?" Michael's answer wasn't comforting, and it wasn't meant to be. He said they always had hope. But no, he did not think Cameron was going to make it. In August of 2010, Michael Douglas announced to the world that he had throat cancer. It wasn't quite true. He actually had cancer at the base of his tongue, a distinction that might sound small, but which he later admitted was deliberately softened for the press because he was about to go on a massive publicity tour for Wall Street. Money never sleeps, and there was no way to cancel it. So the team around him made a decision. Tell the world it's throat cancer and leave it at that. The reality was far more serious than even that headline suggested. It was stage 4, a walnut-sized tumor at the base of his tongue. Catherine Zeta-Jones, his wife of 10 years at that point, was furious. Not at him, but at the doctors, telling reporters that he had spent months seeking help for persistent ear and throat pain, and no one had found the cause until the cancer was already advanced. Michael underwent 8 grueling weeks of chemotherapy and radiation. He was offered surgery instead, but it would have meant removing part of his jaw, a procedure that could have taken away his ability to speak and possibly ever act again. He chose the harder road instead, hoping to keep both. It worked. But surviving stage 4 cancer changes a person, and Michael has said, many times since, that it changed him completely. He described coming out the other side of it like a kind of rebirth, like becoming a child again, seeing the entire world a little more clearly, a little more brightly than before. By the time cancer entered his life, Michael had already built a second family entirely. In 2000, he had married Welsh actress Catherine Zeta-Jones, whom he'd met a few years earlier at a film festival, famously telling her, within their very first conversation, that he intended to be the father of her children. It was a bold, almost absurd thing to say to someone he'd just met, and yet it turned out to be exactly true. They married that November, and together they had 2 children, Dylan and Karis, a son and a daughter, who would grow up not in the shadow of scandal or addiction, but inside a household that both parents, by every account, worked hard to keep as normal as fame would allow. And there's a detail buried in his cancer story that almost nobody expects, one that reveals just how differently things were understood at the time. Michael later said that his doctors traced the cancer's likely cause back to HPV, a virus he believed he had contracted decades earlier. It was a strikingly candid thing to admit publicly, at a moment when most people would have simply said cancer and left it there. But that kind of blunt honesty, it turns out, would become something of a pattern for Michael Douglas in the years that followed. A willingness to say the uncomfortable, complicated truth out loud, even when it would have been so much easier to stay quiet. You'd think surviving something like that might bring a family closer together immediately and permanently. For a while it seemed to. But real families rarely move in a straight line, and the Douglas family was no exception. In 2013, just a few years after Michael's cancer battle, he and Catherine Zeta-Jones announced they were separating. After more than a decade of marriage, after facing down a life-threatening illness together, the relationship cracked anyway. A reminder that surviving a crisis together doesn't automatically heal everything a marriage carries. But it didn't last. Within months they had reconciled, and Michael later credited his brush with mortality for helping him understand what actually mattered. Family, he said, gives him more purpose than anything else in his life. Every marriage goes through moments like that, he explained. You've both got to want to make it work. And if you do, it can actually make you stronger than you were before. And through all of it, the cancer, the separation, the reconciliation, there was still Cameron, still in prison, still fighting his own battle 3,000 miles away from the family that loved him, but didn't know for years whether he'd survive it. Cameron was finally released in 2016, and what he did next surprised almost everyone who had followed his story. Rather than quietly disappearing from public life, he wrote a memoir, Long Way Home, laying out in unflinching detail exactly what those years of addiction and imprisonment had actually looked like. The brutal fights, the withdrawal, a broken leg that went untreated for 4 days, and underneath all of it, a young man trying to explain what it actually felt like to grow up in the shadow of two legends, and to have no idea who he was outside of that shadow. The most powerful part of Cameron's story isn't the addiction itself. It's what came after. He sat down with his father for a joint television interview, the two of them talking openly, on camera, about things Cameron later said they had never discussed, just the two of them, privately, in all the years before. He described that interview as genuinely healing, a moment where father and son finally said out loud everything that had gone unspoken for far too long. Cameron has since rebuilt his life entirely. He's sober. He's an actor again, following, however improbably, in the footsteps of both his father and grandfather, even sharing the screen with his father in a later film, a quiet, full-circle moment that would have seemed impossible during the darkest years of his addiction. He's a father himself now, raising a young daughter, determined, in his own words, to help other families going through what his family went through. To maybe, as he put it, save a life. He's spoken candidly about where the addiction actually came from, describing a deep loneliness underneath all of it, a feeling of being unmoored inside a family whose fame made ordinary connection almost impossible to find. Drugs, he later wrote, were simply his path out of that loneliness. The wrong path, but one that for a long time felt like the only one available to him. And through all of this, the addiction, the cancer, the reconciliation, one figure remained at the center of the family's story, growing older and somehow, impossibly, still thriving. Kirk Douglas kept going. After his 1996 stroke, after the private darkness of that moment with the gun and the tooth, he rebuilt his ability to speak well enough to accept his honorary Oscar just weeks later, walking onto that stage to a standing ovation, while his slurred speech reminded everyone in the room exactly how close they'd come to losing him. He kept working, kept writing, publishing 10 books, becoming, by most accounts, the world's oldest active celebrity blogger for the next 2 decades. He appeared at the Academy Awards again in 2011 at 94 years old, cracking jokes with the same sharp humor that had defined him his entire life, poking fun at younger stars half a century his junior, as though nothing about him had slowed down at all. He would later say that humor was exactly what saved him after the stroke. Not medicine, not therapy alone, but the simple, stubborn refusal to stop finding things funny, even the darkest moments of his own life. It's a strange kind of wisdom, coming from a man who once considered ending everything, and it seems to have shaped how his entire family eventually chose to survive their own private disasters. Not by pretending the pain wasn't real, but by finding a way to keep living anyway. In 2018, something happened that brought the entire family's story full circle in a way that feels almost too perfect to be real. Michael Douglas received his star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, and Kirk Douglas, then over 100 years old, was there to watch it happen. Michael would later describe that day with genuine emotion, saying he hadn't expected to feel so much watching his father sit there, proud, at the ceremony. Between the two of them, Michael pointed out, they represented something like 120 years and over 130 films of Hollywood history. A father and son who had somehow both survived long enough to see it. Kirk Douglas died on February 5, 2020, at the age of 103. Michael announced it himself, in a statement that managed to be both public and achingly personal at once. To the world, he wrote, his father had been a legend, an actor from the golden age of movies who lived well into his golden years. But to Michael and his brothers, he was simply Dad. The funeral was held 2 days later, quiet and private, attended by his wife of 65 years and his 3 surviving sons. A year after his father's death, Michael posted a tribute online that said more in a few short lines than most tributes manage in pages. At 103, he wrote, his father had picked a pretty good time to go. And then, simply, I love you with all my heart. So where does that leave this family now? 3 generations deep into fame, addiction, cancer, and survival. It leaves them, as far as anyone can tell, closer than they've ever been. Michael and Catherine are still together, still, by his own account, prioritizing family above everything else that fame ever offered him. Cameron is sober, working, raising his own child, and speaking openly about addiction in the hope that his story might help someone else's family avoid what his went through. And Kirk, though gone, remains present in every interview Michael gives, every anniversary tribute posted online, every reminder that behind the golden age glamour was simply a father trying, like every father, to leave something worth remembering behind. Maybe that's the real story, hiding underneath 8 decades of Douglas family films. Not the Oscars, not the box office numbers. But 3 men, across 3 generations, each nearly lost in their own private darkness. A stroke, an addiction, a cancer diagnosis. And each one somehow finding their way back to the people who loved them. It would have been easy for any one of them to become simply a headline, a tragic footnote in someone else's biography, the way Eric Douglas's story so often gets reduced to a single sad sentence in articles about his more famous relatives. Instead, each of the other 3, in his own time and his own way, chose to keep going. Kirk chose it in a moment so dark it's almost unbearable to imagine, stopped only by the smallest, strangest twist of fate. Michael chose it through 8 weeks of grueling treatment and years of quietly rebuilding a marriage that nearly ended. And Cameron chose it in a prison cell, alone, deciding somewhere in those months of solitary confinement that the life waiting for him on the other side was still worth fighting for. There's a version of this story that could have ended very differently at almost any point along the way. If that stroke had been just a little worse. If that cancer had been caught just a little later. If Cameron had stayed in that cycle just a little longer. The Douglas name might be remembered today the way so many other Hollywood dynasties are. As a cautionary tale, a story about fame consuming everything it touches. Instead, somehow it became something else. A story about what it actually takes to hold a family together when every possible thing seems designed to pull it apart. 3 men, 1 family, 130 films between them and countless headlines about their fame. But the story that actually matters was never the one on the screen. It was the one they lived, quietly, in hospital rooms and prison visits and family statements written in the rawest kind of grief, proving, generation after generation, that even the most famous families are, underneath everything, just families, doing what every family does. Holding on to each other for as long as they possibly can.